Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. A couple years ago, I was in California and took the opportunity to go and visit the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. It blew my mind as I had the opportunity to see the history of the man who served as our former president. I was able to read and to learn about how he grew up and his acting career and his life outside of the Oval Office. I was so impressed by what I was able to learn that day, I made the decision that if I was ever close to another presidential library, I would make the trip and go. When we were in Little Rock, I had the opportunity to go to the Clinton Museum. When we lived in Texas, I went to George H.W. as well as George W. Bush's presidential libraries. And I loved learning about these men. But living here about an hour from Atlanta, I'm a little embarrassed to say it's taken me 6 years to go and visit the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. So a few weeks ago, Tristan and I made the trip over to Atlanta and tried to learn a little bit more about our 39th president, about the way that he grew up, his naval career, and what he did after his time in the Oval Office. All of these presidential libraries have this common thing where they put different quotes and speeches and quips from that president over the walls in the corridor. There was one in the Carter Library that caught my attention. It's really been on my mind. It's a quote that he made at a commencement speech in 1997 at the University of Notre Dame. The quote is, "We fought fire with fire, never thinking that fire is better quenched with water." Our text this morning comes from John chapter 4, and John makes this offhanded comment that the Pharisees are keeping count of the baptisms between Jesus and John the Baptist. And they're letting the people know that Jesus is ahead in this weird competition. It seems that they're trying to pit the followers of Jesus and the followers of John the Baptist against one another. John the Baptist was a powerful and fiery preacher, and it seems that the Pharisees aren't very successful in their debates with him. We've already noticed that Jesus was too smart, too quick, too brilliant for the Pharisees to win a debate with him. So it seems like their new tactic is to see if they can get the followers of Jesus Christ and John the Baptist, these two rogue rabbis, to fight with one another. The very next thing that we read in John's gospel is that, Jesus leaves the area and he goes back towards Galilee. But that's not where the story ends. It's actually where the story begins. John's about to tell us two very important things. In verse 4, we read that Jesus had to go through Samaria on the way. And then if you go down to verse 6, you discover that Jesus was tired. Jesus had to go through Samaria. And if this is the first time that you're reading through this story, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. But if you know the story or anything about the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, you know that this was actually a pretty big deal. That's why John adds in verse 9, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Actually, they had some dealings with one another, but those dealings always just added to the animosity and the hate that these two races felt for one another. Now, you and I both understand that Jesus and this Samaritan woman that he meets at the well are not the ones that started the war. They grew up in this deep-seated hatred that goes back for generations. Jesus grew up in a culture that saw the Samaritans as an inferior and unholy people, and the Samaritan woman was a part of a culture that had experienced pain and exclusion at the hands of her Jewish neighbors, and they often retaliated in very violent ways. This was a rift that goes all the way back to Joseph's sons and his brothers. This Samaritan woman and Jesus grew up in an environment marked by hatred, mistrust, suspicion, and for pretty good reason. About 700 years before Christ, the Assyrians invade the northern kingdom of Israel, and they carry away a large part of the Jewish population. The king of Assyria believed that one of the ways that you keep peace in the kingdom is you remove people from their homeland so they don't have any desire to fight to keep it. The Jews that were taken away were replaced with Gentile colonists from other regions. We read in 2 Kings that the remaining Jewish people allowed their children to marry with these new foreign colonists who also brought their gods with them into the land. These new families, they didn't really have any interest in worshiping God. When you get to 2 Kings 17, we discover that God's not going to sit back and allow the promised land to be overrun with fake, false, dead gods. So he sends a plague of lions to the land. Now, an actual plague of lions that come in and begin to maul and to devour the people. As you can imagine, it doesn't take long for the people to realize something's got to change. And since they're living in the Jewish land, they ask the king of Assyria to send them a Jewish priest who can teach them about Jewish practices and laws. So an exiled priest is allowed to return home, and he begins to teach the people about the law and the books of Moses and the commandments of God. But the people act more like the Jews than people who really wanted to change, and they try to merge their worship of God with their worship of idols. By the time we get to the book of Nehemiah, we discover 70 years after the southern kingdom fell, the Persian king Xerxes allows Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls around the city. The Samaritans come and they offer to help, but the Jewish leadership under Ezra and Nehemiah reject not just the Samaritan offer for help, they actually reject the Samaritans as half-breeds. So the Samaritans respond by trying to delay the building of the temple in Jerusalem, and they go out and build their own temple on Mount Gerizim. Then 150 years before Jesus is born, Ephanes is the ruler over Syria, and he decrees that the Jews have to worship and offer sacrifices to his god, the Greek god, Zeus. A royal priest named Matthias and his sons organize an army, and with the help of the Romans, they drive the Syrians out of Judah. But that's not enough. Since they have this army, they go and attack Samaria, and they destroy the Samaritan temple. And then when Jesus comes along and he's a little boy, the Samaritans retaliate by sneaking into Jerusalem just before the Passover, and they fill the temple with human bones, which make the temple unclean on the holiest day of the year. So by the time Jesus and the Samaritan woman meet at Jacob's well, the Jews and the Samaritans have been doing these hateful, awful things to each other for hundreds of years. So when John says that the Jews don't associate with the Samaritans, it goes much deeper than just not associating with each other. It's pure hatred. Maybe that's why Jesus had to go through Samaria. The Gospels in the book of Acts are filled with stories of how the Samaritans come into contact with the message of Jesus. Maybe you've discovered that it's not the person from the other side of the world that's the hardest to love. We often struggle to love our neighbor whose skin color or language, values, or customs are different from our own. And maybe that's why John says Jesus is tired. I know that he says that he's tired from the journey. I understand. Jesus is fully human and we share those same limitations. We've all experienced physical weariness. But I wonder if there's not a little emotional weariness as well. I wonder if his weariness started back when he left the Judean countryside because the Pharisees are continuing to try to cause trouble. I wonder if he's tired of the constant fight and he needed a little change of scenery. Have you ever been tired? Not just physically tired, but the overwhelming feeling of being tired by all of the brokenness and fighting, the hatred that you come in contact with on a daily basis? Do you ever get tired of people who spend their life hiding behind a keyboard saying awful things to one another? Maybe you get tired of people who are more concerned with their own personal agenda than they are with the truth, or people that mistrust and always have this suspicion that seems to be so prominent in our culture. Are you tired of people who take your words out of context and use it to question your motives or your intelligence or even your basic worth as a human being? Are you tired of living in a culture that lacks kindness and civility? Or maybe you're just tired of the fighting. Tired of the hatred and the division and the disrespect that bleeds through every single level of our conversation these days. I know I'm tired of racism that judges people solely based on the color of their skin or the language that they speak. I'm tired of the amount of people who falsely believe that they have everything in the world figured out so that they won't even consider listening to someone else's viewpoint. I believe that Jesus was tired. And he has to go to this small well outside a small town in Samaria because he's tired and he needs to do something about it. We discover in verse 7 that Jesus had sent his disciples to go into a Samaritan village to buy something to eat. And so for a moment, get this picture in your mind. You have a group of Jewish people that walk into a Samaritan city to find something to eat. And my mind comes up with all of these questions. What are these disciples thinking as they walk into the city? What do the residents of Sychar think about these Jews walking their city streets? Can the disciples actually eat the food, or will it make them unclean since they got it from half-breed unclean people? But God's writing the story, and none of those questions really matter. What matters is what's going on back at the well. We read, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Now, knowing what you do about the history between the Jews and the Samaritans, it's easy to understand her response. You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? While I believe that Jesus was hot, tired, and thirsty, I also believe there's something deeper going on here. If you're going to change the world, really change the world, you're going to have to learn how to listen. So Jesus starts a conversation with a Samaritan woman. A Samaritan woman who's been married 5 times and at this present time is living with a man that's not her husband. Apparently, it's not just Jesus who's tired. Maybe the Samaritan woman is tired as well because she's willing to listen. She's tired of what the people are saying about her. She's tired of the side-eyed glances that the respectable people in town give her. She's tired of going out to this well during the heat of the day to draw water. She's tired of all of this. So she's willing to do the unthinkable and talk and listen to a Jew, a stranger. Jesus is willing to cross every barrier to bring rest to a weary soul. He's willing to do the unthinkable and show kindness to a Samaritan woman. John mentions in verse 27 that when Jesus' disciples returned, they were shocked that he was talking with a woman. Men didn't talk to women, at least not in public, unless it was their wife or their mother or their sister. As a general rule, talking to strange women in public was considered shameful. That's how ugly rumors get started. But Jesus is intent on bringing rest to this weary woman by engaging her in a deep conversation. He spoke to her like she mattered. He spoke to her with kindness, and he offered her what her soul so desperately longed for. Jesus replied to her, "If you only knew the gift God has for you and who you were speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water." This woman is weary from coming to get water from this well in the heat of the day, and now you have a stranger talking about living water, not common water. He has her full attention. Jesus shares with her the secret to finding rest. She's just not there yet. She can only think about this water. She wanted whatever he's offering, but only because she wants to avoid coming out to this well every single day. And honestly, I can't really blame her. I think all of us have had times where we're only interested in God, we're only interested in Jesus because we're looking for something to satisfy our physical desires. Like this woman, we've all allowed our physical needs to make us completely unaware of our deeper spiritual needs. But Jesus is offering her something much deeper. And he takes the conversation to the next level. He says, "Go and get your husband." And John lets us know one more reason why this woman is weary. She's been married to 5 different men. She's currently living with a guy that she's not married to. I want to be really careful here because I don't want to pile on and just assume the worst about this woman. I understand the text says she's had 5 husbands and now she's living with a man out of wedlock, but I want to be careful and not jump to conclusions. Remember, the Samaritans have the law of Moses. They know Deuteronomy 24, where it says women are not allowed to divorce their husbands or to contest a divorce. If your husband decided he's done with you, he just simply writes you a piece of paper saying you're divorced. But also notice that Jesus didn't say that she'd been divorced 5 times. He said she had been married to 5 different men. It's just as possible that instead of being divorced 5 times, she had been widowed 5 times. I mean, their culture has to deal with warfare and famine and disease and injury. It's possible that all of her husbands had died. And in those days, a widow either turns to begging or prostitution or getting remarried. 4 times the Samaritan woman had chosen the best option. 5 marriages don't make her a sinner. But now she's in a different relationship. Her 6th relationship's not with her husband, and that's not really something she wanted to talk about, especially not to a stranger. So she tries to change the subject. I get that. I've had a lot of conversations with people where when the subject turns to spiritual matters, they get really, really quick to change the subject and let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the weather or football or anything. It's not lost on me that Jesus never refers to this woman as a sinner. And I know she goes back into town and she tells everyone she meets, come see a man who knew about all the things that I did, who knows me inside and out. But really, that sounds like somebody who was offered the rest that her soul was looking for, not somebody who was yelled at or scolded or rebuked. A few verses before John tells this story, he would write, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." In the heat of the day, at a small well in Samaria, Jesus begins to show his disciples, to show us just how much God loves the world. God's love includes everyone, even the people who are on the opposite sides of the track than we are. People that don't understand, people that don't share our political views, people whose lives look a whole lot messier than ours do. People that are tired. People like a Samaritan woman who had been married 5 times and is now living with some other guy. That's what Jesus means when it says that he loves us and he wants us to love others. As we get ready to make our way to the tables, I want us to take a moment to remind ourselves that there's nothing in all of creation that matters to God as much as people do. Jesus willingly gave his body, his blood, and his life for fallen, sinful people like you and me. In spite of our sinful actions, in spite of our constant rebellion against him, God still loves us and he wants us to love him back. We gather at the table with all of the scars from our own sinful choices. We gather as weary travelers who are broken and surrounded by our failures. We gather to remember how God surrounds us with his love and his forgiveness and offers us rest. And as Jesus offers us rest, he's inviting us to offer his rest to one another. Are you tired of fighting? Wouldn't you prefer to hear, to see, and to live out a better story? Jesus shows us that it begins to reaching out, to listen to other people's stories, maybe to put your own story on hold so that you can listen. That's what Jesus and the Samaritan woman did at Jacob's well. And it made such a huge difference for that woman and for her neighbors, just to know that they mattered to Jesus and they mattered to God. I understand that you're weary. I understand that you're tired. I understand that there's so much going on in the world and in your community and in our culture that it just takes the life right out of you. But Jesus comes to offer us rest and to offer us peace. Not to take the storms of life away from us, but to allow us to find peace and rest in the midst of those storms, in the midst of the trials, in the midst of the tribulations and the struggle. In the midst of all of that, we can find the peace and the rest that comes from the Prince of Peace, who gave his body and his blood so that we can have a relationship with him and with our Father. So I hope as you sit and you spend time around the table this morning, as you reflect on the body and the blood of Jesus, that you're able to think about what gift Jesus is offering you when he offers you to come and to find rest. I hope you have a wonderful week this week, that you never ever forget how deeply you are loved by God and by Jesus, the one that created you, the one that redeemed you, and the one that sustains you. Have a wonderful week. Go in peace. I look forward to seeing you very soon.